When Nelson Mandela was released in 1990 after 27 years of political imprisonment, the world thought we had removed the chains restricting Black economic prosperity in the largest economy in Africa. We now know that Black economic prosperity in South Africa is heavily tied not solely to the political structure that separated the races, but also is strongly dependent upon such elements as economic empowerment policies, corporate pioneering, and perpetuating the habits and behaviors compatible with abundance. I'm an expert on perpetuating values and behaviors through story via my extensive research on Black family heritage books. These books heroize ancestors' development through tribulation and triumph, propelling future generations to indwell self-identities that enable substantive legacies. To better understand how South Africa's economy is ripening as an investment opportunity for African Americans, we'll explore here 5 key points. The fall of apartheid, including the country's economic infrastructure plan, the change in the South African economy from 1990 to the present, several major players who lead the business landscape in billion-dollar scaling up, key sources for U.S. investment advice and implementation, and Black genealogy books' role in shaping intergenerational values and behaviors conducive to economic success. So first, the fall of apartheid. South Africa to end apartheid or be cut off from global trade, we put enough teeth behind that call and were at it for a long enough time that apartheid did indeed fall. It started back in 1948, following the electoral victory of the white-ruled National Party. The first global movement against apartheid's racial segregation regime came 11 years later, in 1959, with a UK-led boycott. Then, in the 1970s and 80s, the anti-apartheid movement evolved into a massive global effort. It was driven by student uprisings, cultural boycotts, and international economic sanctions, with the US Black population playing leading roles. Apartheid officially ended in 1994 after a series of negotiated settlements, following the repeal of apartheid legislation and amid Mandela's election as the country's first Black president. The Black Economic Empowerment Program was adopted in 1994 and later adapted to the broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Program, or BBEE, as the primary vehicle for Black participation and significant growth in South African investment and intergenerational wealth creation. Under BBEE trusts, shares of companies are held on behalf of a specific individual, family, or community. What Black South Africans wanted for themselves and what we, the world, wanted for them was a solid place in their nation's economy. So next, we'll take a look at some highlights of South Africa's economy and Black people's place in it in 1990 compared with the present. In 1990, South Africa ranked 27th among world economies, with a $116 billion GDP, compared with the US's number one world economy of 5.96 trillion. South Africa was in 1990 and remains today the largest economy on the African continent. We can see that the total population between 1990 and 2025 grew by 68%, up to 63 million. And the percentage of Black South Africans grew slightly from 76% to 82%, and the raw number grew by 80%, up to 52 million. The nominal GDP, again at 116 billion in 1990, was up more than 200% by 2025 to 372 billion. A measure of Black well-being, the life expectancy at birth, grew slightly to 64 and a half years from 62 years. And another measure of Black economic well-being, the unemployment rate, drastically to 35%, which is up 54%. And while in 1990, Black South Africans owned less than 1% of national wealth, by 2025, ownership had increased, but still was less than 5% of the wealth of a typical white household. Delving further into the changes between 1990 and 2025, we see that top earners included practically no Black South Africans in 1990, and in 2025, Black South Africans composed 41% of the country's highest income bracket. Also, in 1990, Black South Africans earned a negligible amount of equity, and by 2025, they earned about 7% of the South African held assets on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. In terms of real estate, again, in 1990, ownership was negligible, and by 2025, while ownership is growing substantially, it is very illiquid. And in terms of the lower income level people, they were restricted to low-wage labor in 1990, and they're heavily sustained by government grants and public transfers in 2025. In terms of changes in the economy's major sectors over time, we see that manufacturing was the largest economy sector back in 1990, accounting for about a quarter of the economy. And by 2025, that had decreased to about 12%. There was a similar flip in the role of finance, real estate, and business services in the economy, accounting for about a quarter of the economy in 2025, up from about 12% in 1990. Personal services, including government contracts, accounted for about 17% of the South African economy in 2025. Trade, catering, and accommodations, which includes travel was basically the same at about 13–14%. And transport, storage, and communication grew to one of the top 5 sectors in the South African economy by 2025. And that includes the infrastructure for information flow. Despite its relatively impressive economic growth and sector shifting, South Africa faces challenges in its economic performance. To point out just a few of these challenges, we see here that while GDP and GDP adjusted for the cost of living rank the economy 38th and 33rd globally, per capita GDP, both raw and adjusted for the cost of living, ranks it at 107th in the world. As the World Bank puts it, this performance proves that aggregate national wealth does not translate into individual prosperity here. Also, real GDP is growing more slowly than in other parts of the continent. And again, the unemployment rate is high at about 1/3 of the eligible workers, one of the highest in the world. One of South Africa's biggest economic challenges is immigration. This issue was in the news a great deal in June 2026, including with residents calling for illegal immigrants to exit the country by a June 30th deadline. Another impediment to Black South Africans' full economic development is low rates of educating natives to do the work required in a developing economy. About 47% of South African adults do not have the equivalent of a high school diploma.